They told me it was just dirt, just an unused patch of land that nobody cared about anymore. But the moment I stepped out of my truck that morning, the smell hit me first. Freshly turned soil mixed with something older, something that didn't belong under a brand new stretch of emerald green grass. And then I heard it, the low mechanical hum of a backhoe idling 50 yards ahead. Its engine vibrating through the ground like a warning I was already too late to hear. And that's when I saw the stakes, 12 of them, white markers tossed carelessly into a pile beside the newly flattened earth like forgotten fence posts, except they weren't fence posts, they were headstones, or what used to be, and standing right there in a pressed white polo and mirrored sunglasses was Brenda Whitmore, HOA president, clipboard tucked under her arm like she was overseeing a landscaping project instead of erasing history. And she didn't even look surprised to see me, she just glanced up, gave me that tight, rehearsed smile, and said, "You're standing on private development property, sir." Like I was the one out of place, like I hadn't grown up walking this exact stretch of land, like my grandfather hadn't shown me where every single grave lay decades before her precious golf course ever existed. And I remember the crunch of gravel under my boots as I took a step closer, the air feeling heavier with each breath, and I asked her, calm, steady, "Where are the markers?" And she tilted her head like I just asked something ridiculous, like I was slowing down her schedule. "Relocated," she said, one word, flat, dismissive, like she was talking about moving lawn chairs instead of 12 people who had names, stories, families, and then she gestured behind her, toward a freshly laid strip of sod that stretched out in a perfect arc. "This is going to be the new fairway, increases property value by at least 12% across the community." And that's when it clicked, not just what she'd done, but why all of this, the machines, the early morning work crews, the rush timeline. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't a mistake, it was a decision, a calculated one, made because somewhere in her mind, a few old graves were worth less than a better view from the clubhouse patio, and I could feel something tightening in my chest, not anger, not yet, something colder, something slower. Because I'd seen this kind of confidence before, the kind that comes from thinking you're untouchable, from believing the rules bend for you because you sit at the top of a small, self-appointed kingdom. And Brenda Whitmore ruled this neighborhood like it was hers to reshape, hers to improve, hers to erase. If it didn't fit the aesthetic, and she looked at me like I was just another complaint she could file away, another resident she could fine into silence, and she had no idea who I actually was. No idea what she just set in motion, because to her, I was just Alex Vaughn, the quiet guy in the old house at the edge of the development, the one who never showed up to HOA meetings, the one who didn't fight back when the violation notices started stacking up in his mailbox, the one who kept his head down and his property exactly the way it had always been, and she thought that meant I didn't matter, that I didn't have the leverage, the resources, the patience to push back. But standing there, staring at those displaced markers, feeling the ground that used to mean something reduced to a smooth, artificial surface, I realized something she didn't, something she couldn't afford to understand too late, because this land wasn't just dirt. And this wasn't just a golf course expansion, and what she had just done, over something as small as a better fairway, was trigger a chain of consequences big enough to swallow this entire community whole. And she was still smiling when she told the crew to keep moving, like she'd already won, like the story ended with her getting exactly what she wanted, and that was the moment I decided I wasn't going to argue, I wasn't going to shout, I wasn't even going to warn her. Because the kind of mistake she just made doesn't get fixed with a conversation. It gets corrected with something far more permanent, and she was about to learn that the quiet ones aren't harmless. They're just waiting for the right moment to remind you exactly who owns the ground you're standing on. The engine behind me was still ticking as it cooled, a slow metallic clicking that echoed in the silence Brenda left behind when she walked off to supervise her perfect green strip of denial, and I stayed there longer than I should have, staring at the uneven ground where those graves had been, because memory does not just disappear when you scrape the surface clean, it lingers in the shape of the land, in the way the dirt settles differently. In the faint depressions only someone who knows where to look can see, and I knew every inch of it, because my grandfather had walked me through this place when I was 8 years old, his hand heavy on my shoulder as he pointed to each resting place like he was introducing me to old friends, telling me their names, their stories, reminding me that land is not just owned, it is inherited with responsibility. And that responsibility does not vanish just because someone in a pressed polo decides it is inconvenient. And I remember him telling me something that felt small back then, almost like a passing comment, but now it came back sharp and clear, that the land was protected, not by fences or signs, but by paperwork, by records filed long before any of these houses were built, long before any homeowners association thought they had authority over it. And that was the part Brenda did not understand. She saw grass and potential and profit margins. She saw property values and golf carts and weekend brunches at the clubhouse, but she did not see the chain of ownership that ran deeper than her bylaws, deeper than her committee votes, deeper than her entire development. And as I turned back toward my truck, I could hear her voice again in the distance, giving orders, confident, efficient, completely certain that everything was under control. And that confidence almost made me smile, because it meant she had not checked, she had not asked the right questions, she had not pulled the right documents, and that kind of oversight does not just lead to a fine or a warning, it leads to something much bigger, something that unfolds slowly at first, and then all at once, and by the time she realizes it, there is no simple fix, no quick meeting to vote it away, no letter she can send to smooth things over. And I drove out of there without saying another word, gravel crunching louder this time, like the ground itself was keeping count, and 20 minutes later I was sitting in a quiet office downtown, the air inside cool and still, the kind of place where decisions get made long before anyone else feels the consequences. And when I placed the old folder on the desk, the one my grandfather had handed me years ago with a simple instruction to never lose it, I watched as the attorney opened it carefully, flipping through pages that most people would not understand but that carried more weight than any HOA rulebook ever printed, and he looked up at me after a minute, eyebrows slightly raised, not surprised exactly, but impressed in that quiet, professional way, and he asked me one question, just one. Do they know? And I shook my head, because if Brenda had known, she would not have touched that land, she would not have allowed a single machine within 100 feet of it, and she definitely would not have built a fairway over it, and that was the moment everything shifted from a personal insult to a structural collapse waiting to happen, because what she had disturbed was not just ground, it was a legal boundary tied to ownership rights that extended far beyond one patch of dirt, rights that connected to access roads, water lines, utility easements, and most importantly, the very parcels her entire community sat on. And as I leaned back in that chair, listening to the quiet hum of the office lights instead of construction equipment, I realized something that made everything feel almost inevitable, because Brenda thought she was expanding a golf course. But what she actually did was step onto land she never had permission to touch, land that did not belong to the homeowners association at all, land that, on paper and in every legal sense that matters, still belonged to me. By the time I left that office, the sun had shifted just enough to cast long shadows across the street, the kind that make everything look stretched and distorted, and I remember thinking that was exactly what had been happening in that neighborhood for years, everything dressed up, polished, controlled, but underneath it all the foundation had always been slightly off, and now all it took was one bad decision to expose it, and I did not rush back, I did not call anyone, I did not send a warning letter or demand an explanation, because that is what Brenda expected, a complaint, a confrontation. Something she could dismiss or bury in paperwork, but what I had was not a complaint, it was leverage. And leverage works best when the other side does not even realize it exists, so instead I drove past the entrance to the community, past the stone sign with its carefully landscaped flowers and the small bronze plaque that read, Whitmore Estates. Her last name stamped into the identity of the entire place like a signature she thought would last forever, and I kept going until I reached the service road that most residents did not even know about, the one hidden behind a line of old oak trees. Because that road was not part of the HOA, it never had been, it was an access easement tied directly to the original land parcel, my land parcel, and every delivery truck, every utility vehicle, every maintenance crew that kept that neighborhood running used it without thinking twice, because it had always been there, invisible in the way things that work properly tend to be, and I parked there for a moment, engine off. listening to the quiet, and I could already see the shape of what was coming together, not as anger, not as revenge in the way most people think about it, but as a correction, a recalibration of ownership and authority that would ripple outward in ways Brenda could not stop once it started. And later that afternoon I made 2 calls, both short, both direct, the kind of calls that do not need explanations because the people on the other end already understand what the documents mean. And by the time the sun went down, things had already begun to shift, quietly, beneath the surface, because the first thing people do when they realize a boundary might be wrong is verify it, and verification leads to questions, and questions lead to pauses, and pauses in a place that runs on constant maintenance and scheduled services are not small, they are disruptions. And the next morning, while Brenda was probably reviewing landscaping plans and preparing for another day of control, the first sign appeared, not dramatic, not loud, just a simple delay, a delivery truck idling at the entrance longer than usual, a driver checking his paperwork twice, calling in to confirm access rights that had never been questioned before, and I was there again, parked far enough away that no one noticed, watching as routine started to hesitate. And that hesitation spread faster than any argument ever could, because once one contractor starts asking whether they are authorized to use a road, others follow, and within hours the questions reached the companies that mattered: water management, electrical maintenance, waste services. All of them tied to easements and agreements that traced back to original land ownership, and I could almost picture Brenda's expression when the first call came in, polite but firm, asking for clarification on access permissions, something she had probably never had to provide before, something she assumed was already hers to grant. And that is the thing about assumed authority, it works perfectly until someone proves it was never real to begin with. And I sat there in that quiet strip of shade, watching a system that had run smoothly for years begin to slow. Not because anyone was attacking it, but because the truth had been introduced into it. And truth does not need force to create change, it just needs time and the right pressure points. And as another truck turned around instead of entering, choosing to wait for confirmation rather than risk a violation, I realized Brenda was still playing the same game she always had, enforcing rules, issuing fines, controlling appearances. But she was about to find out that the rules she relied on only existed within a boundary she never actually owned, and once that boundary is questioned, everything inside it becomes uncertain, and uncertainty in a place built on control is not just inconvenient, it is the beginning of collapse. It started with confusion, the kind that spreads quietly, before anyone realizes it is a pattern, and by mid-morning I could already see it ripple through the neighborhood without stepping a single foot inside it, because once one contractor hesitates, the rest begin to question everything. And that is exactly what happened as the landscaping crew that had been trimming hedges along the entrance simply packed up early, not because they were told to, but because their supervisor could not get confirmation on whether their equipment was insured for access on a road that was suddenly being flagged as disputed, and that word alone, disputed, carries more weight than any fine or warning Brenda had ever issued, because it introduces risk, and risk is something companies avoid without hesitation. And I watched as another truck arrived, slowed down, and then reversed back out onto the main road, the driver shaking his head while speaking into his radio, and it was subtle at first, almost invisible to anyone who did not know what normal looked like, but I did, and I knew this was not normal, this was the beginning of friction, and friction in a system built on smooth operations creates heat fast. And by noon the first rail crack appeared when the waste management service missed its scheduled pickup, not delayed, not rescheduled, just absent, because somewhere in their chain of verification someone flagged the route as requiring updated access authorization, and without that, their insurance would not cover entry, and suddenly what had always been routine turned into a liability, and that is when residents started noticing trash bins left at the curb, lids rattling in the warm afternoon breeze, people stepping outside, checking their watches, looking around like something was off but not quite understanding what, and inside the clubhouse I could imagine Brenda fielding the first wave of calls, her tone still controlled, still confident, assuring people it was a minor scheduling issue, something that would be resolved quickly, because that is what she had always done, maintain the illusion that everything was under control, but control depends on authority, and authority depends on legitimacy, and legitimacy is exactly what was unraveling beneath her, because by early afternoon the water maintenance contractor issued a temporary hold on non-essential service requests until easement documentation could be verified, and that was not something she could talk her way around. That was not a neighbor complaint or a landscaping violation, that was infrastructure, and infrastructure does not respond to tone or confidence, it responds to legal clarity. And without it, everything pauses, and I could feel the shift growing larger. No longer just small hesitations but a system-wide slowdown, and I stayed exactly where I needed to be, outside, unseen, letting the process do what it naturally does when the foundation is questioned. And later that day my phone buzzed once, just once, a short message from the attorney confirming that formal notices had been filed, not aggressive, not dramatic, just precise, outlining ownership boundaries, easement control. An unauthorized land modification, the kind of language that does not threaten but guarantees consequences. And I knew exactly when Brenda would read it, probably standing in that same office where she signed off on the golf course expansion, probably expecting another routine document she could delegate, until she reached the part that clarified that the land she had altered was not under HOA jurisdiction, that access routes depended on agreements she did not control, and that any continued use without authorization would expose the association to significant liability. And that word liability changes everything, because it does not just affect one decision, it affects every decision connected to it. And suddenly the fairway she was so proud of was not an upgrade, it was a problem, a very expensive one, and as the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across those perfectly cut lawns, the neighborhood began to feel different, quieter in a way that was not peaceful, but uncertain, like something fundamental had shifted just out of sight, and I knew she was still trying to hold it together, still believing this was temporary. Something she could fix with a meeting or a call or a carefully worded announcement, but what she did not understand yet was that this was not a single issue, it was a chain reaction, and every hour that passed without resolution made it harder to contain, because the more people who questioned access, the more systems paused, and the more systems paused, the more visible the problem became, and for the first time since I had known her, Brenda Whitmore was no longer controlling the narrative. She was reacting to it, and that shift, that single loss of control, was the beginning of everything coming apart. By the next morning the illusion was completely gone, not shattered in some dramatic moment but worn down piece by piece until there was nothing left to hold it together, and I could tell before I even reached the edge of the community because the line of vehicles stretched farther than it ever should have, contractors idling, service vans parked along the shoulder, drivers stepping out with paperwork in their hands instead of tools. All of them waiting for answers that no one inside could give them, and I stayed back just enough to watch without being part of it, because what was happening now was not about confrontation, it was about exposure, and exposure works best when it is undeniable, and by 8:30 the first official notice had made its way through the HOA office, not from me, but from the county. A formal acknowledgement of a boundary dispute tied to historical land records, which meant everything connected to that land was now under review, and review does not stop at one patch of dirt, it spreads to access points, utility lines, maintenance agreements, every invisible system that keeps a neighborhood functioning, and suddenly the golf course was not just incomplete, it was unusable, marked with temporary barriers while legal clarification was pending. And that alone created a ripple that Brenda could not contain. Because the golf course was the centerpiece of her entire development plan, the selling point, the justification for increased dues, the promise of higher property values, and now it was sitting there untouched, a perfect strip of green that no one could legally use, and inside the community the tension was starting to surface in small but noticeable ways. Residents gathering in driveways, talking in low voices, checking their phones for updates, asking questions that did not have clear answers, and every answer that did come back sounded the same: delayed, pending, under review. Words that do not calm people down, they make them uneasy, because they suggest something bigger is wrong, something that cannot be fixed quickly, and by mid-morning the second wave hit: insurance. Because once a property is flagged in a legal dispute, coverage becomes conditional, and conditional coverage leads to reevaluation, and reevaluation leads to increased premiums or temporary suspensions, and that is when the numbers start to matter, not in small fines or monthly dues, but in thousands, then tens of thousands, then more, because risk has a price, and when that price changes suddenly, it affects everyone, not just the person who caused it. And I could almost trace the exact moment Brenda realized this was no longer manageable, because around noon the HOA sent out a community-wide message, polished, carefully worded, trying to frame everything as a temporary administrative issue, assuring residents that operations would return to normal soon, but the tone was different, less certain, more reactive, and people can feel that difference even if they cannot explain it, and the responses came fast, questions about trash service, about water access, about property values, about whether their homes were even fully compliant with whatever boundary issue was being mentioned, and that is the part Brenda never planned for, because when people start questioning ownership and legality, they do not stop at one issue, they start looking at everything, and everything in that neighborhood was tied together through agreements she did not fully control, and by the afternoon the real shift happened, not outside, but inside, because a few residents began pulling their own documents, reviewing their purchase agreements, their disclosures, their title reports, and once that starts, it spreads faster than any rumor, because it is not speculation, it is verification, and verification leads to concern, and concern leads to action, and I knew exactly where that path ends because I had seen it before in other places where assumed authority collapses under legal scrutiny, and it never stops at inconvenience, it escalates into disputes, claims, and eventually financial consequences that no single person can absorb. And I sat there watching it unfold, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet certainty. Because this was no longer about 12 graves or one unfair decision, it was about the structure Brenda built her control on. And that structure was never as solid as she believed, it was just never tested until now, and now that it was, every weak point was starting to show at the same time, and the cost of fixing it was already growing beyond anything a simple HOA budget could handle. And she still had not realized the full extent of it, because she was still trying to contain it. Still thinking in terms of meetings and statements and temporary fixes. But what she was facing was not temporary, it was systemic, and once something becomes systemic, the only direction it goes is bigger. By the third day it was no longer confusion or inconvenience, it had become a full stop, the kind of halt that does not just interrupt routines but forces everyone to confront what is actually holding everything together. And what I saw that morning made it clear that the system Brenda had been relying on was no longer functioning at all, because the entrance that used to feel controlled and polished now looked uncertain. Almost neglected, with no service vehicles coming in, no maintenance crews moving through the streets, and the silence was different, heavier, not peaceful but uneasy. And inside the neighborhood that unease had turned into pressure, because without regular services small issues do not stay small, they stack up, they become visible, and visible problems demand answers, and answers were exactly what Brenda could not provide, because every question led back to the same point, access and authority. And neither of those belonged to her anymore, not in any enforceable way, and by mid-morning the next layer of consequences began to surface. Financial institutions, because once a property is tied to an active legal dispute involving land ownership and infrastructure access, lenders take notice, and when lenders take notice, they reassess risk, and reassessment leads to flags, and flags lead to restrictions, and suddenly homeowners who had nothing to do with the original decision were receiving notifications that refinancing requests were being paused, that pending approvals were under review, that appraisals could not be finalized until the situation was resolved, and that is when the scale of what Brenda had triggered became impossible to ignore, because this was no longer about maintenance delays or inconvenience, this was about money, real money, tied to mortgages, to equity, to long-term investments that people depend on, and I could almost hear the shift in tone across the entire community as concern turned into urgency, and urgency turned into frustration. And that frustration needed somewhere to go. And it always moves toward the person in charge, and for the first time, Since she took that position, Brenda Whitmore was no longer the one giving directives, she was the one being questioned, and not just by residents, but by the very system she depended on, because every contractor, every service provider, every institution was now asking for the same thing: proof, documentation, clarity, things that cannot be improvised or asserted, they have to exist. And in this case they did not exist in her favor, and I stayed exactly where I had been, outside the boundary. Watching the structure continue to strain under its own assumptions, because the truth was simple and unchangeable: the land she altered was not hers, the access she relied on was not hers, and the authority she exercised only worked as long as no one challenged it, and now it had been challenged in the most precise way possible, not through argument, but through verification, and verification does not create noise. It creates consequences, and by early afternoon those consequences reached the point where they could no longer be contained internally, because a group of residents formally requested a full review of HOA governance and land use authority, something that had likely never happened before, and that request alone introduced a new level of exposure, because it meant everything Brenda had approved, signed, or enforced could now be examined, not just the golf course expansion, but every decision connected to property boundaries and shared infrastructure. And once that door opens, it does not close easily. And I knew she was trying to hold it together, trying to reassure people, trying to present this as a temporary disruption, but temporary problems do not trigger financial reviews, they do not halt services across multiple providers, they do not cause residents to question the legality of their own property agreements. And as the afternoon stretched on, the neighborhood that once felt controlled and uniform now felt fractured, not physically, but structurally, like the underlying framework had shifted just enough that everything built on top of it was no longer stable. And I could see it clearly, even from the outside, because I knew exactly where the fault line was, and more importantly, I knew it was not going to stop here, because the kind of mistake Brenda made does not resolve quietly, it expands, it pulls in more systems, more people, more consequences, until the cost of fixing it becomes larger than the system itself can support, and that was the point she was approaching without even realizing it yet, because she was still thinking in terms of control. And control was already gone. It was the fourth morning when everything finally crossed the line from unstable to unsustainable, and you could feel it before you even saw it, the kind of tension that sits in the air like humidity, thick and unavoidable, because by then the small inconveniences had stacked into something much heavier, something people could not ignore or explain away anymore. And I watched as a line of residents gathered outside the clubhouse earlier than usual, not for a meeting that had been scheduled, but because they needed answers now, not later, and inside that building I knew Brenda was no longer setting the tone, she was trying to keep up with it, and that is a losing position when the questions are bigger than your authority, because the questions had changed. They were no longer about trash pickup or landscaping delays, they were about ownership, about legality, about whether the place they had invested their lives into was actually secure, and those are not questions you can calm with reassurances, those are questions that demand proof, and proof was exactly what she could not produce, and around mid-morning the next development hit, quiet but devastating in its impact. Because one of the larger utility providers issued a formal suspension notice for non-critical infrastructure access pending legal clarification, and that single notice did more damage than any argument ever could, because it confirmed what people were starting to suspect, that this was not a temporary issue, this was a structural one, and once that confirmation exists, confidence disappears fast, and without confidence the entire idea of a controlled, stable community begins to fall apart, and I stayed where I had been all along, just outside the boundary, watching it unfold in real time, because what was happening now was not something I needed to push anymore, it was self-sustaining, each consequence feeding into the next, each delay creating more uncertainty, and uncertainty driving more scrutiny, and by noon the financial impact was no longer theoretical, it was immediate. Because at least 2 pending home sales inside the neighborhood were placed on hold after title companies flagged the property records for additional review, and that is the kind of disruption that spreads quickly, because real estate transactions are sensitive to risk, and once one deal pauses, others follow, and suddenly what had been marketed as a premium community with rising value was being treated as a potential liability, and I could almost hear the conversations happening behind closed doors, residents calling their agents, their lenders, their attorneys, asking the same question in different ways. What is actually going on here? And the answers they were getting were cautious, incomplete, filled with phrases like ongoing review and unresolved boundary concerns, and none of those words build confidence, they erode it, and that erosion was accelerating by the hour, and sometime in the early afternoon my phone rang, not from an unknown number, but from one I recognized, because it was the first time Brenda Whitmore had decided to reach out directly, and I let it ring once, twice, just long enough to feel the shift in control before I answered, and when I did her voice was different, still controlled on the surface but tighter underneath. Like someone trying to hold the structure together with too many cracks forming at once, and she started with formality. Referencing administrative misunderstandings and temporary disruptions, framing everything as something that could be resolved through cooperation, but I did not interrupt her, I let her speak, because this was not about what she said, it was about what she finally understood, and when she paused, expecting a response, I gave her exactly one sentence, calm, steady. The same tone I had used that first morning when I asked about the markers. I said that the land she altered was not under her authority and that all access tied to it required my authorization moving forward, and there was a silence on the other end that lasted just long enough to confirm that she had finally connected the pieces, not just the graves, not just the fairway, but everything tied to it, and that was the moment the balance of power fully shifted, because she was no longer dealing with a resident. She was dealing with the owner of the very ground her entire system depended on, and there was no policy, no committee, no vote that could override that, and as I ended the call, the noise from the community in the distance felt different, less controlled, more urgent, because the truth had finally reached the person who needed to understand it most, and once that happens, everything that follows becomes unavoidable. By late afternoon this shift was no longer subtle. It was visible in every corner of the neighborhood, in the way cars slowed instead of cruising, in the way neighbors stood in small clusters instead of waving from a distance, because uncertainty had turned into urgency, and urgency does not stay quiet for long, and inside the clubhouse the emergency board session that Brenda called was already unraveling before it could stabilize, because the documents they depended on no longer supported their authority in the way they assumed. And every attempt to reframe the situation as temporary was immediately met with questions that cut deeper, questions about liability, about exposure, about whether the association itself had crossed a line that could not be undone with simple corrections. And while those conversations grew more intense, another layer of pressure arrived from outside, because once the legal review flags appeared in the property records, lenders and insurers began adjusting their positions, not aggressively, but carefully, which in practice meant restrictions, delays, and reevaluations, and those words might sound procedural, but their impact is anything but small, because when financing slows down and insurance becomes conditional, the entire economic foundation of a community starts to tremble, and that tremble was spreading house by house, contract by contract. And by early evening the first formal notices began circulating among residents, not from the association, but from their own representatives, advising caution, advising review, advising patience, and patience is a difficult thing to maintain when your home is involved, when your investment is tied to decisions you did not make, and I could see it in the messages that started to surface online. Private neighborhood groups turning into open forums of concern, people comparing notes, timelines, documents, realizing that the situation was larger than any single complaint, and that realization changes behavior quickly. Because once individuals understand they are part of a collective problem, they start acting collectively, and that is when control truly slips away. And sometime just after sunset Brenda called again, but this time there was no formality left, no attempt to manage the tone. Just a direct request to meet, to discuss resolution, to find a path forward, and I agreed, not because I needed to negotiate, but because timing matters, and the right moment can define the entire outcome. And when we sat across from each other that evening the difference from our first interaction was unmistakable. The confidence that once filled her voice had been replaced by calculation, by the careful selection of words that signal awareness of risk, and she spoke about cooperation, about shared interests, about preserving the community. But every sentence circled the same unspoken truth, that without access to the land, without the authority she had assumed, everything they had built their expansion on was unstable. And I let her speak until there was nothing left to add, and then I placed a single document on the table, not complicated, not dramatic, just clear, outlining the ownership structure, the access dependencies, and the contractual limits that had been overlooked. And as she read it, slowly, line by line, the scale of the situation settled in, not as a possibility, but as a certainty, because this was no longer about a dispute. It was about consequences that had already begun, consequences that extended far beyond a single decision, reaching into financing, into insurance, into property value, into the long-term viability of the entire neighborhood, and I explained it simply, without raising my voice, without adding pressure, because none was needed, that restoring access would require more than reversing a decision. It would require accountability, compliance, and a restructuring of authority that acknowledged the actual ownership beneath everything they managed. And when she finally looked up, there was no argument left, only the realization that the position she had held so firmly was built on ground she did not control, and outside, beyond the windows, the neighborhood lights flickered on one by one, but the sense of stability they once represented was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding that what had started as a small, careless decision had triggered something far larger, something that could not simply be put back the way it was. The morning after the meeting felt like the first real silence the neighborhood had experienced in days, not peaceful silence, but the kind that follows something irreversible, and I could sense it before I even saw anything happening, because the movement that used to define the community had slowed into something uncertain, almost suspended, as if everyone was waiting for the next instruction that no one was coming to give. And when I drove past the entrance that day, there were no long lines of service vehicles, no coordinated maintenance crews, no scheduled activity that once gave the place its rhythm. Instead, there were just residents, standing in small groups, speaking in lower voices, looking at the streets they used to trust without question. And the difference was not physical, it was psychological. Because once people understand that authority is conditional, they stop treating it as absolute, and that changes everything about how a place functions. And inside the HOA office, Brenda Whitmore was no longer issuing directives in the same confident cadence she once used, because every system she relied on had already begun requesting verification she could not fully provide. And I was not inside that room, but I did not need to be, because the pattern was already clear. Lenders had tightened conditions, insurers had placed restrictions, and service providers were no longer operating on assumption but on documentation, and documentation always leads back to ownership, and ownership leads back to me, and that was the point where the structure stopped being negotiable. And by midday a formal notice was issued to the association confirming a mandatory cessation of all non-essential modifications to the disputed land until final legal resolution, which effectively meant the golf course expansion was frozen in place, not demolished, not reversed, but halted in a state of uncertainty that no amount of internal discussion could override. And I remember sitting in my truck when I received confirmation of that notice, not reacting outwardly, because there was nothing left to react to. The chain of events had already completed itself. And everything after that point was just consequence settling into reality. And later that afternoon I returned once more to the edge of the property, not to observe chaos, but to observe adjustment, because that is what follows disruption when it reaches completion, systems recalibrating, people reorganizing their understanding of what is possible. And I saw Brenda standing near the clubhouse entrance, no longer surrounded by assistants or board members, just her alone for a moment, looking out at the fairway that had once been presented as her achievement, and was now defined by restriction. And when she noticed me, she did not approach immediately, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend in the way she once tried to. And when she finally did speak, her voice carried none of the certainty it once had. Only the weight of recognition that the framework she depended on was not something she controlled, and I told her calmly that this was never about taking anything away, it was about restoring what was already established before her decisions changed the surface of it. and that the resolution would come not from negotiation, but from alignment with the actual structure of ownership and responsibility that existed beneath all of it, and for the first time she did not respond with deflection or authority, she simply listened, because understanding had finally replaced assumption, and by evening the neighborhood no longer felt like it was collapsing or exploding, it felt like it was settling into a new configuration, slower, quieter, more cautious, with every resident now aware that the systems supporting their daily lives were not as simple or as permanent as they once believed. And I drove away as the lights came on across the community, each one no longer a symbol of stability, but of awareness, because what had begun as a single decision driven by control had ended in a complete redefinition of control itself, and as I left the road behind me, there was no sense of victory or defeat, only the quiet confirmation that once truth enters a system built on assumption, nothing inside that system can return to the way it was before.